Good morning all. This is John Kogan. I'm the CEO of Proformative, the online community and resource for corporate finance, accounting, treasury, and related professionals. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Debt Compliance Management, Benchmarking Survey Results, and Best Practices. The credit markets continue to thaw, and this means more firms are getting access to credit. But that does not mean that debt covenants are becoming any less cumbersome. Few companies can afford the high monetary cost and loss of credibility that comes with defaulting on their debt due to inadequate compliance. This afternoon, we will outline best practices in establishing debt compliance management, review the results of a benchmarking study focused on debt compliance practices, and discuss emerging technology being used to manage debt compliance and mitigating the risk of debt compliance, of non-compliance, pardon me. Joining us today to help with that are the folks from Debt Compliance Services, whose commitment to thought leadership helps make this event possible and delivered at no cost, like everything on Proformative. A quick note on today's agenda, we will hear a joint presentation from two renowned experts in debt covenant compliance management, and then we will move to a panel discussion where we will spend the remainder of our hour. We would like this to be an interactive experience for you, so if you have questions at any time, please go to the questions area in your GoToWebinar control panel and send us your questions. We will queue them up. We will dole them out when we get to the panel discussion, and we'll do our best to get all of them in. I would like to note that this presentation is already posted on Proformative, where anyone can download it for free. And we will send a follow-up email to everyone with a link to the presentation. So you can just wait a few hours if you like, and you will get that email, and you can simply click on the link and download it. We will also send you a survey at that time, and we appreciate your giving us any and all feedback. We always like to know what we can do better. We are offering CPE credits for the CPAs in today's audience. To facilitate that, we have two polling questions that we will be asking during the presentation today. So we will take a brief break for the two polling questions. Even if you're not interested in the CPE questions, in the CPE credits, pardon me, we would love for you to answer these questions in these polls, and then we will revisit the results of those polls during the panel discussion, so everyone can benefit from seeing what their peers have said. This will be completely confidential and just very quick polls, so we appreciate your participating in them. I'd like to go ahead and say a word about Proformative. For those who are new to Proformative, this might be your first brush with us. We're the largest and fastest growing online resource for senior finance, treasury, and accounting professionals online. We reach over 400,000 finance, accounting, and treasury leaders on a monthly basis. The site is completely non-exciting. It's simply people asking questions about work and getting answers. Everything from the practical to the highly technical, accounting, treasury, finance, you name it. It's completely ad-free and noise-free, so no ads on the site, no cost at all to participating, and it's a really singular sort of resource. So highly encourage folks to check it out if you have not already. Today we're going to be covering a lot of ground, and we expect you'll be a heck of a lot better off on understanding debt compliance, creation of debt compliance policies and processes for your companies, and technology around managing debt compliance. We're looking forward to getting you information and insight into these issues which affect most companies. And helping us do that today are two folks who are absolutely steeped in today's content. I'd like to start out by introducing Jim Simpson. He's a co-founder at Debt Compliance Services. Jim has over 35 years' experience as a senior corporate financial officer and as a corporate treasury consultant. Prior to co-founding Debt Compliance, he specialized in corporate finance at Corporate Finance Solutions, which he started in 2003. He was an EVP and CFO of Moore Medical Corporation, a publicly traded $300 million company, and EVP, CFO, and Director at CS Brooks, a privately held $200 million company, as well as being Treasurer of Sandoz USA, now part of Novartis. Jim has closed over $4 billion in IPOs, private equity, and a whole host of other leasing cash flow and similar facilities. and a wonderful person to have with us today. Joining him will be Jeff Wallace, co-founder of Debt Compliance Services. Jeff also has over 35 years of experience as a corporate treasury professional and as a corporate treasury consultant. He's also the managing partner of Greenwich Treasury Advisors, LLC, an independent treasury consultancy he founded in 1992. He's the author of the G31 report, Core Practices for Managing Multinational Foreign Exchange Risk, published by the AFP, and wrote the FAS 133 chapter for the International Finance and Accounting Handbook, published by John Wiley. Jeff was Vice President, International Treasury at American Express and Assistant Treasurer at both Seagram and Dun & Bradstreet. He is also a CPA and was formerly with Price Waterhouse. Jim, I'd like to hand it over to you and welcome both of you to our event today.
Thank you very much, John. We'll go through the agenda in just a minute, but just a couple other words about DCS. We were founded in 2009, and it is a joint venture between Jeff's firm and my firm. And we're the only firm that we're aware of providing an integrated automated cloud solution to covenant management. What we're going to talk about today, I'm going to take you through the next two bullets, which is access to capital and debt compliance risk. And then I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to talk about the debt compliance survey that we did over the summer of 2011. And he'll also then talk about best practices in debt compliance policy. And then I'll wrap it up with applying web technology to debt compliance. We do have quite a bit to get through. Access to capital, I think most of you would agree that, you know, a primary CFO and treasurer responsibility is maintaining the access to capital. And, you know, this includes optimizing capital structure of their company, maintaining excellent relationships with capital providers and credit rating agencies, and bolded here is ensuring that their company is in compliance with all requirements of their debt agreements. Because after you have optimized your capital structure and maintain excellent relations, you need to follow it up, and you need to get down into the credit agreements and understand them and make sure you're in compliance. As we talk about lenders' expectations, you know, debt compliance, when I've talked to lenders in the past, it's a key filter with which lenders evaluate companies and the competence of its management team. Coming to a bank every so often and saying, well, we have this problem or that problem, you know, while they might be able to look the other way once or twice, if it continues, it really brings questions. So lenders expect companies to fully understand their credit agreements from top to bottom. And they expect that it will be effectively managed vis-a-vis the operating performance within the debt agreements. And while the CFO and treasurer cannot cure poor business results, which could impact their ratios, their job is to minimize the impact by not surprising their bankers. So, for example, forecasting financial covenants and monitoring emerging issues to identify future compliance risks is very, very important. Proactively managing their bankers about these risks, and then seeking consents before the fact and not waivers and amendments after the fact. So in other words, the job is not to come in the last minute and say to your bankers, I have a problem, because that puts your banker at a severe disadvantage with his bosses. So if we can then go on to the next slide here, and we're going to move right into the debt compliance risks, where we can talk about what is part of that. And it's our view that debt compliance risk is one of the most significant enterprise risks that a company faces, because the consequences of a default are so substantial. However, this risk is often overlooked, misunderstood, and minimized. As a matter of fact, a lot of companies who are dealing with enterprise risk rarely, if ever, identify debt compliance and its effects as an enterprise risk. So to take that further, many companies believe that their covenant risk is limited to ratios in submitting their financial statements. And they are relying on the kindness of their bankers if they default on any of the other covenants. We believe that that is short-sighted because any default, no matter whether, and as I call them, big D or little d, default gives a lender the whip hand to take any remedial action. And as one of our clients said to us, it was the worst day of my life, and every day I thought I would be fired. And it's that sort of feeling that missing any of your covenants can bring. And in addition, the auditors and the board are becoming more involved. Many credit agreements, as I'm sure many of you are aware, now require a comfort letter from the auditors regarding knowledge of any default. And then under the new SEC proxy rule, which the number is shown here, which came out last year, companies must now disclose the board's role in any risk oversight, including how such risks are identified, managed, and mitigated. And we believe that that should include, and does include, covenant compliance risk. And as we go on to what comprises covenant requirements, many companies don't know that their senior credit agreement can have as many as 80 clients. As a matter of fact, where we work with companies, that is about the average. And they include things like financial ratios, which, interestingly enough, only comprise maybe 2 or 3 of the 80. Permitted baskets, which gives you leeway to do certain things under indebtedness and so on. And there might be as many as 8 to 10 of those. Affirmative information reporting and notices, I'm sure you're all aware of that, as to when you have to provide your financial information. But also there are a lot of notification requirements. There are a slew of other affirmative covenants. There are occurrence-based covenants and triggers, events of default. And then there are the myriad of negative or restricted covenants. But again, any default is a default. And as we say, relying on the kindness of your bankers, even though they're probably great people, is not a good career strategy, because at some point that decision may be taken out of their hands. So if we go on to talk about the high non-monetary costs of default, and we'll talk about the monetary side in just a moment, there is disclosure. Press releases and 8K public disclosure if it gets to the point of a default. Temporary or permanent loss of access to credit. I worked with a company a number of years ago who had a little d default, but because it had been going on for a little while, unbeknownst to them, they lost access to their credit, all credit, for a period of about a month, and that was a big issue. And that can lead to things like business disruption and customer and vendor concerns. There also can be financial restatements, because if there was a default in a prior period, you may have to go back and restate your balance sheet, and you may even have to go back and restate the income statement. While I find that usually not the case. And then there is the risk of being cited by the auditors for a material weakness or a significant deficiency. Could lead to workout, forced refinancing, fire sales, but whatever it is, it does lead to a substantial diversion of management time. If we can go on to the next one, let's just talk a minute about the high monetary cost of default. We've taken this as an example, a $50 million three-year facility. It has $40 million outstanding, and you can use this to multiply. A company that is in default they're going to have to pay some fee in order to come out of a default. Now, for a very minor default, sometimes the banks, that could be very small, but on average, in the last several years, they've been averaging around 50 basis points. In many cases, companies have experienced when there has been a default, no matter if it's big D or little d, and especially a couple of years ago, that meant that the interest spread that was comprised in the credit agreement could be increased. And in those cases, it could be up to 200 basis points. And then you have the default interest spread, which is in every credit agreement, which deals with the period with which you are in default, and they add another 200 basis points there. There's increased commitment fees and other legal and audit fees. So a default of a $50 million could range up to nearly $3 million. Now, if there's not an increase in the spread of $2 million, it's still about a $750,000 cost. And when you come right down to it, the loss of management credibility, we call that priceless. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to turn this over to Jeff Wallace, who will take us through the next two parts of the presentation.
Okay. Thank you, Jim. In August, we did a survey of 192 companies on their debt compliance practices. 2/3 of them said that they reported to their board on their debt compliance results. And about almost another 2/3 said that they had a comprehensive covenant checklist. Only a fifth had a debt compliance policy. And when we put together, asked them about other standard compliance practices, which includes beyond the checklist, questionnaires, a calendar of due dates, and a quarterly analysis of client compliance exceptions, that these who used 5 or 6 of these practices, which is about a 10th, had very good results, which we'll see in the next slide. The interesting thing that we found is that while everyone could agree that these are all good things to do, the question is what happens if you don't do these things, if you take half measures? And we found that many are ignorant of all their covenants, using only a list of major covenants instead of a comprehensive list. They use few standard compliance practices and do no forecasting and stress testing of their covenant ratios and permitted baskets. So here is a little breakdown of the 192 companies. And as you can see, it's a good cross-section of American multinationals, with about half that are non-investment grade and half that are investment grade. And when we asked them about their debt compliance practices, we asked them how effective they thought their practices were on a 1 to 5 scale, with 1 being excellent and 5 equal very poor. We will use these assessments, these self-assessments, to compare debt compliance practices. And because we've had such a large sample size, we found some rating differences that were statistically significant. We're briefly going to give you the report, and if you want a more detailed report, please go to our website. Now, John is going to come back, and we're going to have a polling question. John?
Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and put out the first of our 2 polling questions, and you will see that coming onto your screen in just a moment. So you see the very straightforward yes or no question here. This is not a test, by the way. This is just something we're required to do to give the CPE credits. But once again, we'd love to hear from everyone because we'll revisit this at the end of today's presentation. It's all anonymous, don't worry, and it will just give us some good information for our discussion at the end here. Also, I'd like to remind folks that we have the panel coming up after the slides are presented, and we'd love to get your questions as we go here, so feel free to add your questions via the question section in your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll do our best to get to them during the Q&A period. All right, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and close down the poll, and we will get back to Jeff.
All right. So please move on to the next slide, John. So what were the major findings? Well, using these self-assessments, we found that there were 4 critical debt compliance practices that resulted in the highest ratings, and that these practices are cumulative and reinforcing in their effectiveness, and not doing these practices results in significantly lower ratings. So if you go to the box, we had about 1/10 of the group use 5 to 6 compliance practices. And this would be out of 7 compliance practices, which we identified as a comprehensive covenant checklist, a list of only major covenants, marked up debt agreements, questionnaires, calendar of due dates, a quarterly analysis of possible or actual compliance exceptions for the CFO to review before he signs off on his letter, and written debt compliance procedures, but no policy. And if you look at the first row, the 1/10 of the group that used 5 to 6 compliance practices rated the effectiveness of their debt compliance on a 1 to 5 scale as 1.69, where 1 is excellent. The half of the group that only used 0 to 2 compliance practices, of that 7 that I just listed, had a rating of 2.41, which is a large difference of 0.72, and is also statistically significant at the 0.1% level. If we look at having a debt compliance policy, which about 1/5 the group had, they rated themselves 1.9 versus 2.43 for the rest of the group that didn't. We believe a debt compliance policy is really critical, because it really forces the rest of the company to get involved in debt compliance. A fair number of our Treasury prospects and clients have mentioned that without a policy, and when you go out and ask the field some questions that you need to get answered before the CFO can sign off, you know, it's almost as if the field is doing you a favor answering your questions, and that's just not right. We also looked at 2/3 would report to their board on a regular basis on their debt compliance results, and that was a rating of 2.13 versus the 1/3 of the group that didn't and had a 2.67. The use of a comprehensive covenant checklist, again, significant difference between those not using a comprehensive list. And putting it all together, if they were using 4 to 6 practices, they had a policy, and were doing board review, they had a 1.64 rating, which was the highest of these possibilities, versus the people that were only using 1 to 2 practices, no policy, no review, which was remarkable, 1/5 of the group, 2.74, and we really have the largest difference in effectiveness. Now I'm going to go into more detail and look at financial covenants. You know, these are the EBITDA to debt ratios and things like that. The clear best practice looking at the results is that stress testing forecast financial covenants over several future quarter ends, which of course requires forecasting, is without a doubt the best practice with a 2.09 rating, and almost 1/3 of the group was doing it. The people that were calculating monthly actuals only just really was not quite as effective at all. And forecasting the quarter end was also equally ineffective. So the takeaway, in which we're going to summarize in our policy, an outline of a debt compliance policy, is stress testing the future really makes a lot of sense. Because what you want to do is to find out about potential problems in the future so that you can notify your bankers ahead of time and get that waiver, because really the last thing you want to do is sheepishly, 30 days after the end of the quarter, is to call your friendly banker and tell them, hey, we broke our covenant ratios, as if it was a big surprise to you. It looks like you don't know how your business is going. Now let's talk about permitted baskets. Permitted baskets, of course, are those things that the debt agreement normally prevents you from doing, but will allow you to do up to certain limits. So this might include additional debt, use of letters of credit, and other types of ways of increasing the credit risk. Similar with financial covenants, we see a similar story. Forecasting and stress testing of several future quarter ends is more effective than forecasting the current quarter end and calculating monthly actuals. Now, one of the points that we've found in discussing with clients about their debt compliance practices is this incredible fact that 34 companies, 21 of which were below A rated, believe that they do not have any permitted baskets and said not applicable. And everybody has permitted baskets, and at least these people were honest enough to say, well, we don't have any permitted basket issues, and also our debt compliance is not very good. So with that 2.45 rating that you see on the bottom row of the chart. So the takeaways, again, are forecast and stress test, or in the case of permitted baskets, see how close you're getting to your limits. And we'll talk a little bit more in the policy outline about what people should be doing with their permitted baskets. Now, after financial covenant ratios and permitted baskets, we have a big catch-all group of non-financial covenants. And covenant checklists are really the most effective way to manage the myriad of affirmative, negative, and occurrence-based or trigger event covenants. And when we talk about the 80 covenants, 80 to 100 covenants that a less than investment grade senior credit agreement might have, you're really talking about maybe 90% of those things are going to be these non-financial covenants. And we find in how people manage them that flipping through the debt agreement to see what these covenants are and to see whether you violated them or not is considered to be the least effective. And you can see that in the review debt agreements row, the second from the last. Changes by covenant category in the rank ordering. So you see that depending on the type of covenant, there's some slight changes in which practice is the best. Sort of reflects the nature of the fact that restrictive or negative covenants are going to be different than occurrence-based covenants. And again, note that there's a fifth of companies who do not believe that they have any of these kinds of covenants, and also, again, look at their poor ratings. And this is, the thing that's interesting is that every quarter, these people are saying that they're in full compliance with all of their obligations of their debt agreements, and yet they don't know what their debt covenants are. So let's put the results of these survey into something actionable, and we've come up with a debt compliance policy. So let's go over what the policy should be. Well, any policy should start off with policy objectives. And the first objective, of course, is to accurately determine and maintain in a timely manner your compliance with debt agreements. And more importantly, one of the reasons why you want to do this is so you can maintain the company's access to capital on the best possible terms by anticipating potential covenant issues and proactively managing the lenders. The second point is that you want company-wide, not just financial and legal, responsibility for compliance. we found that many managers outside of finance and legal are, hard as this to believe to Treasury people, are often surprised that the company has debt that includes important obligations that may impact the company's operations. And as a result, these same people are often unaware of the potential impact of what might be otherwise appropriate business decisions on the company's covenants. So a classic example might be of this is that there are restrictions on sale of assets, and when you sell the asset, many lending agreements would require you to either reinvest the sale proceeds into other equipment or property, or if it isn't done within something like 180 days or 270 days, the money should be gone to pay off the debt. So you could have a plant controller someplace out in Podunk seeing a $10,000 obsolete piece of machinery that they sell to the junkyard for $10,000, and Treasury just isn't going to know about that. And that's sort of a classic example of why, depending upon how onerous your debt agreements are, why you may need to go down deep into your organization to make sure that you haven't violated some of these restrictive obligations. Then you want to define and assign responsibilities to Treasury, accounting, legal, other HQ departments, and business unit management for who's going to manage the quarterly debt compliance process, which is typically Treasury, although sometimes it's controllers. We want to get everybody to be involved with proactive identification and reporting of potential covenant issues. Who's responsible for delivering all those notices, reports, fees, and schedules to lenders so that there's no question about who's responsible for delivery. And of course, providing numbers for calculating and forecasting covenant ratios and permitted baskets. Really, ideally, you don't want Treasury doing the forecasting. You'd like FP&A to go out and do the forecasting of the ratios, because they understand their job is forecasting, whereas Treasuries can't have the in-depth business knowledge that FP&A has. Then we would describe in 4, describe the compliance process and what's going to be used. And so you'd want to have this comprehensive covenant checklist. And more importantly, with that checklist, you'd want to assign responsibility for each covenant to people that are either knowledgeable about or can make decisions affecting that covenant. This is the way you go down deep into the organization. Having identified those people, you'd want to have tailored quarterly questionnaires asking each person about their signed covenants, about the company's compliance with those covenants. You'd want to have a calendar of due dates for all deliverables and fees, an exception analysis, and we believe that an exception analysis is critically important. What it is it's a quarterly report for the CFO's review on all identified exceptions and issues. Now, in the process of checking to see whether you're in violation with all of your covenants, you may find issues in which the violation, or it's just an issue, it isn't material enough to report to the lenders, but this is something that you're going to want to monitor or manage or somehow keep an eye on to make sure that it doesn't become important enough to have to report to the lenders. And of course, you'd want a quarterly archiving process. With the people that have assigned debt covenants, well, their responsibilities include accurate and timely response to the questionnaires and the requirement to proactively involve Treasury and legal as soon as they're aware of circumstances or decisions that could impact their assigned covenants. With regards to financial covenant procedures, we would want to have regular forecasting of the covenant ratios on at least a 12-month rolling basis, so at least 4 quarters out. And the forecasting, as I'd mentioned, is based upon the company's current forecasting process provided by FP&A. In other words, the forecasts are not made up by Treasury. We want to get the FP&A boys there responsible for forecasting because they're the ones that know the business better for forecasting purposes. And of course, we want to do stress testing of the ratios so that we determine how much leeway exists in each covenant before it's breached. So for example, in a classic covenant like EBITDA to debt, you would want to hold EBITDA debt and see how much debt could increase before you break the covenant. And similarly, you'd want to hold debt constant and see how much EBITDA could decline before you broke the covenant. And you'd want to do this for at least 4 quarters out. Permitted basket covenant procedures would be similar. Again, we'd want to do regular forecasting and permitted baskets 4 quarters out. Regularly determine the excess capacity as you're going out those 4 quarters. And most importantly, you don't want to set it up so that people in the field can willy-nilly add to those covenant baskets. You'll want to establish an approval process that requires Treasury approval before an item is added to a permitted basket. If you don't have the approval process, you're just not controlling it, and you can end up at the end of the quarter with a exceeded basket with all the problems that that can entail. Finally, what's left, as we've talked, is the 90% of those 80 to 100 covenants, those affirmative, negative, and occurrence-based covenants. And we believe the best way to do it is those tailored questionnaires based upon a comprehensive covenant checklist tailored to each person that has been assigned responsibility for those covenants. Finally, we would have a CFO review procedure, and you'd want the CFO to review a resolution report analyzing possible and actual compliance exceptions and deciding what to do on how to manage the emerging issues or emerging exceptions. And then, of course, we'd want the financial covenant analysis and the permitted basket schedules, both actuals and forecasts. You would also want to have at least annual presentation on the debt covenant compliance to the audit committee of the board of directors, or as we are now starting to see, risk committees of the boards of directors. You want to be able to train the operating managers on their debt compliance responsibilities, teach them a little bit about what the debt is all about, the consequences of default, and how the policy applies to them. And finally, the policy would close with appendices, which would list the comprehensive covenant checklist, the respondents, the financial covenant ratio calculations worksheets with the stress testing, listing of permitted baskets and their definitions, the approval description of the approval process for adding items to the permitted baskets, and of course a compliance calendar that has all the due dates for the notifications, fees, information reporting, everything else that your lender requires. With this, I'd like to switch back to John. Oh, we're going to have a polling question. John, please go ahead.
Sorry to hop in with that, but that's where it is. We've got one more polling question for everyone. It should be on your screen now. Let's go ahead and take 60 seconds to answer this. Whether or not you want the CPE credit, once again, we'll revisit this. It's all anonymous, so no worries there. Also, would like to take a moment to remind folks, if you have any questions for Jim and Jeff, we will hopefully have some time here at the end to ask those. So please find the question area in your GoToWebinar control panel and ask a question, and we'll put it in the queue. We'll leave this open for another 5 seconds or so, and then we'll get back to your regularly scheduled program. All right, why don't we go ahead and close it out. We'll go ahead and pop back, and next slide. Jim, take it away.
What I'm going to do is we're going to talk about technology for covering everything that you've just heard over the last 40 minutes. And we have a product which is called the DCS Covenant Manager, and it consists of two components. And it's number one is understanding your covenants, and the next is managing your covenants. So what we like to say is that by doing all of that, you'll bring clarity, collaboration, and control to the entire process. So if we look on the just on the left-hand side of this chart, in the clarity and collaboration, the web-based tool for this converts debt agreements into hyperlinked web pages rather than those behemoth paper-based documents that litter your desks or credenzas. Again, the covenant compliance checklist that we've mentioned numerable times here, which identifies responsibilities. That is very critical. And to have that all linked and sitting with the debt agreement is very, very important. A detailed permitted basket and events of default schedules, which are again linked back. So everything is hyperlinked back and forth. And then a calendar of notifications, information, reporting, and fees. That brings you to the point where you understand your credit agreement inside and out. Now, how do you control it? And it goes back to what Jeff is saying. So paper or web-based questionnaires tied and mapped to the checklist and identifying individuals to answer those questions is very important to this. And with the web questionnaires, we provide extensive web reporting and validating and analyzing of exceptions. And this is critical as well, because in order for you to control everything, you need to know what people are saying and how do you deal with those. Again, it's what Jeff was just talking about with the draft best practices debt compliance policy, and then training and understanding everything about this. So the product here brings everything together. And what we like to say is that it makes your credit agreement, rather than the static pile of paper, a living, breathing document. If we could go on to the next slide, John. And we're coming to the end of the prepared remarks. So let's start wrapping this up. In today's uncertain times, even though things are getting a little bit better, the global financial system, as we see, especially with the European banks, is under continuing stress. There's an immense pressure on bank profitability. There are tighter, albeit not as tight as it was 2 years or 3 years ago, and there's a lower corporate profitability. So in these conditions, to avoid the small cost of doing debt compliance right, a CFO is essentially betting on the following: that there's not going to be an inadvertent default due to covenant ignorance. There's not going to be an avoidable default of known covenants due to inadequate processes. The lenders will be forgiving and not raise spreads, charge high waiver fees, and reduce or cancel the credit line. The auditors will not require a restatement, and the CEO and the board will also be forgiving. That's a tall order. We'll go right to the conclusion here. And so let's talk about this for a minute, and then we're going to open it up to the panel discussion. Again, we've said this many, many times, the risks of breaching covenants are greater than ever. And that's because banks are eager to use even the slightest technical defaults to reprice the credit risk. This isn't the case in all cases, but it is an option. The risks are now too great to lead to an informal, incomplete, and manual process. And the development of a compliance policy grounded with a comprehensive compliance checklist is essential. And finally, technology can improve the collaboration between finance and the business units and other departments, significantly reduce compliance time, and minimize errors that turn into expensive defaults. So with that, I'd like to turn it back to John, and John will take us through the Q&A.
Great. Thank you very much, Jim and Jeff, for that. We are going to move now into the Q&A part of today's webinar, and that will take us almost up to the very end of our hour together today. One quick housekeeping issue, because I've gotten this question from a few late arrivals. We will be sending out a link to the presentation in today's webinar, and you can hop onto Proformative and download it free. So that will be coming out to folks. Jim, why don't we start by taking a quick look at the results of the two polls that we put out there. I'm curious how this lines up to what you guys see in the landscape in general.
And Jeff and I will both chime in on this, John. But I would say that that's actually fairly encouraging that we have over half of the group assembled here do have a specific debt compliance policy. Mm-hmm. Many of the clients that we go see, or many of the companies that we see that don't become clients, do not have a specific policy in place. So that is very good. Jeff, would you add anything to that?
Well, it's quite a bit better than our survey results, which had about only 20% with a policy. So as you said, it's quite encouraging. Let's see what the next poll does, John.
You bet. Coming up. Okay, next one will be up in just a second. Here we go.
So here we see that about almost 60% report to their board. And that's certainly consistent that if half of you have a debt compliance policy, you're doing a good job, and you're also doing the next step of reporting to your board. We've often felt that the people without a policy and without a reporting to the board are really sort of would be ashamed to report about their compliance policy to the board, because the board would look at it and say, are you crazy? This isn't good enough. But here, this group, clearly we see a large proportion reporting to the board. We see about 20% saying that they don't do it because they've evaluated the risk is not significant. And if you're investment grade or better, that's certainly an arguable point. But here we see 20% that aren't reporting to the board, and the question for them to think about is this a good thing or not? John, do you have any questions for us?
Yeah, well, let's do an immediate follow-up to that, which is, in your estimation, how much effort is involved in creating a robust debt compliance policy for corporations that don't have one?
Well, the big problem, of course, is going through and developing that comprehensive covenant checklist. And that takes time. It obviously can be mind-numbing, reading 150 pages of dense legal jargon. But that's really what you need to do, because if you're honestly going to say that you're in full compliance with all your debt obligations, you ought to know what those obligations are. And that covenant checklist, and making sure that it's comprehensive, because we saw in the research that if you didn't have a comprehensive list, you really were doing poor debt compliance by a significant amount.
And the tool that you highlighted earlier essentially helps companies translate and maintain visibility to all of their covenants and all of their debt issuances and everything related to managing compliance. Is that what you're essentially getting?
Well, you know, we obviously think our tool is best, but for many companies, we acknowledge that a good comprehensive checklist is the best starting point, and you don't need to put it on the web to get full benefit from it.
Mm-hmm. Got you. Did you have any indication during your survey of the cost of debt relative to people's effectiveness in maintaining debt covenant compliance? In other words, are those who are less compliant, do they, statistically speaking, have a higher cost of money?
No, we didn't look at spreads and things like that, because spreads, we just didn't ask that question, so we really can't answer it for you, John.
Gotcha. What did you find to be the most surprising results in the survey?
Well, I think it was surprising to us to see how ineffective the half measures were. And what half measures would be like a list of major covenant checks, a list of major covenants. And we found out that a list of major covenants was just as ineffective as having no list of covenants at all. And part of the problem with debt compliance is that it's an all or nothing process. Unless you've gone through and checked every covenant, you're at risk. And then the risk is that it shows up a couple of quarters later that you've been in violation of this covenant for a couple of quarters, and then the caca really hits the fan at that point in time. Because as soon as you find out that you're in default, you talk to your lawyers about it, and they say, well, you got the only thing you can do is to go to your lenders, because otherwise, if you don't, you're committing fraud. And so that was the biggest point that we saw that came out of the survey.
In general, and given your guys' exposure to debt agreements, are you seeing any trends in terms of the number or types of covenants required?
I would say that the number of covenants are becoming a bit more specific and stringent. And people may argue with that, but what you have to remember about covenants is, and when we tell companies that, in a typical revolving credit agreement there are 80 some odd covenants, they don't believe us until we go through and show them where the 80 are. And it is important that banks, because what we said earlier in their expectations, they want more and more control of this, which means that there will be new covenants coming into play. And when you start looking at other regulations that could come to the fore or already are there, it only bodes to more reporting, more and more control.
And speaking of more reporting, more control, are you seeing any covenants tied to FX exposure, given all the brouhaha around currencies worldwide?
Not specifically to FX. What you do see in many is when you talk about hedging or any type of financial risk, there is, in many cases, the obligation of the borrower to go out and cover at least half of their interest rate risk. It's a good profit center for the financial institution on that. But as long as you are not speculating, the bank or the lenders are not going to tell you what to do with FX. Mm-hmm. Jeff, would you add anything to that?
Yes, no, I wouldn't. In the sense, I think you've answered the question fully, Jim.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Next up, one of the folks asked a question about agreeing with the difficulty and density of going through these agreements. 150 pages, they say 2 to 250 is what most of those weigh in at. Is there any move afoot to simplify, standardize, do anything to make life easier for the users of those agreements?
Not as they're presently being done by the lawyers. No. I think they get even more complicated. You know, the one thing is that credit agreement, you know, from bank to bank, from legal firm to legal firm, it is, there's some commonality, you know, on some of the definitions and things like that. But other than that, there's nothing there to make things easier. Mm-hmm. I think it's only going to be harder.
And the lawyers get paid by the page, so they're probably not pressing.
The page and the pound.
That's it. And one final question here as we are time is elapsing on us. What would you put as your top 3 items that companies without an effective compliance management regimen should take? What are the actions they can take quickly to sort of get their arms around their issues and maybe get on top of some of this compliance?
Well, I'll take a crack at that, and then maybe Jim can expand on it. A debt compliance policy is really critical because that really brings in the rest of the company to assist Treasury in going over the obligations. Then you have the comprehensive covenant checklist, and you've really then got to take a look at having something like a calendar. And then, as I said, you'd want to have a process that you'd be proud enough to report to your board about. If you're ashamed about it, you've got to ask yourself, why would I have a debt compliance process that I wouldn't dare show to my board because they'd criticize it?
Great. Sounds like a great place to start. You know, I have one other quick question, if we could just answer this one pretty quickly. Any comments on adoption rates of web-based covenant management versus the good old tried and maybe not so true spreadsheet methods?
I think we're seeing more and more companies come into want a web-based approach, mainly because the documents are getting more and more complex. There's cross-default between many of the different types of agreements, and because of that, to rely on your own knowledge and your own or your lawyer's fees and knowledge is not necessarily the best thing to do. One thing I would just add to what Jeff has said, one of the other things that people should take home with them is the portability of a lot of times companies, when they have somebody who is responsible for debt covenant management, you know, they'll leave after, let's say, a couple of years because they get a promotion or they go to a new company, and they take with them all of their notes. And what is important is whether it's on a paper-based or on a web-based system, it's the collaboration and sharing of observations, covenants, and so on that is essential. Because what you don't want to do is every couple of years have to have people relearn and start from scratch. And what happens is a lot of things get forgotten. And because of that, they're more at risk at that time to miss on a covenant. So it's the collaboration, it's the succession planning that is also extremely important.
Great. Thanks for that note. And let's just take care of a couple of housekeeping items here as we come to the end of our hour. First off, thanks to Jim Simpson and Jeff Wallace for their time and attention today. We greatly appreciate it. We had a pretty big crowd on here today, and I'm sure everyone listening got a lot out of that. As you can see on the slide in front of you, we're going to send a follow-up survey. We'd love your feedback. We will also send a link to this presentation that you saw today, so you can just hop on to Proformative and grab it. That's free, of course. Everything on Proformative is free. And thanks to today's sponsor, Debt Compliance Services. We appreciate their time and their generous offer of the resource of the human beings, Jeff and Jim, today. If you have any questions about CPE issues, actually on the slide before, you can see the email of Tanya Walsh. She manages all of our CPE credit programs. If you have any questions at all, just drop her an email. she'll also be the one sending you out the survey, so you'll have another chance to just reply there if you'd like. And finally, we'd like to thank everyone who joined us today. Greatly appreciate your time and attention. We hope to see you again on Proformative or at another event we have in the future. Best to all, take care, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.